What is fundamentally consciousness made out of? How does it relate to free will? Can you be conscious without information? And is there any connection between consciousness and the observer effect? These are the discussions for today. My name is Michael Taylor. I'm a computer engineer with a background in physics, and I'm here to discuss quantum consciousness with you today. Right up next. Despite the fact that we've had many advances in neuroscience and psychology, the exact nature of consciousness remains a complete mystery. We do not fully understand consciousness experiences and how they emerge from the workings of our brain, or why certain states of consciousness, such as dreams and altered states, occur at all. That's the first thing we need to prove, really, in science, is does consciousness truly arise from the workings of our brain, or is the working of our brains just interacting with consciousness? It's a complex subject. There's lots of different layers to consciousness. The experiences include sensory perceptions, thoughts, emotions, self-awareness, and understanding how all these elements work together creates, well, it creates what we understand as a cohesive experience. And is it unique to humans? That's another question. What is the consciousness of a mouse or an ant? Do they have the same, subjective experience? On ethics and morality, how does consciousness relate to our value systems? Is there an inherent concept of good and evil that's built into our conscious fabric of reality? And artificial intelligence, what does that say about consciousness? Will we truly be able to make artificial consciousness, machines that can feel? I know about one thing, without question, I don't think it takes a lot of consciousness to feel pain or hunger. I don't know. Does an amoeba feel hunger? It sure looks like they do. Fungus. Does fungus, store information? It appears that they do. The way fungus spreads out and learns its environment and memorizes where a food source is, it's a lot like a neural network in many ways if you ever study the principles by which fungus manipulate and understand the environment around them. So where does consciousness go down to? I mean, how far down this rabbit hole can we take the concept of consciousness? Is it truly limited to living things? As in wetware? We know that there are single-celled organisms that apparently have the ability to learn. That means they can store information without a neural network. How? But at the same time, how does the morphology of simple animals, where does that information come from? Is it in the DNA? Does DNA store information about morphology? It doesn't seem like it. Let's think about it. How can your DNA be the source of truth for your morphology? I mean, where your eyeballs are versus your nose versus your elbows versus your liver and spleen. Every single cell in your body has the same exact copy of DNA. So how does one cell know from another cell what it should be? There's almost a concept of morphological consciousness. Yeah, a morphological consciousness. Even at a single cellular level where there's an understanding of your role in a community of cells. Often we underestimate the complexity of a single cell. At a high level, they look very simple, but then when you reach into the level of molecules, you recognize the sophistication, the tapestry of biological art, how all the different chemical machinery works across a landscape of immense, just unbelievable amount of sheer information. Information that tracks the state of all types of functions inside a cell, that it uses various different chemical messengers in order to maintain equilibrium with its environment. Is there consciousness there? And is it limited to, at this point, to chemistry, to molecules? Can we take consciousness down further to perhaps the quantum level? And if so, what evidence is there for consciousness to exist below the level of chemistry? When we're talking about simply the forces of the universe, the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, the forces that are felt between quantum particles. Is there consciousness there? Well, that's what I'm here to discuss with you again. Let's move on to that first question. What is consciousness? Because before we start talking about what things are conscious, we need to understand what is the true definition of consciousness that we can all agree on. And I think you have to start with one fundamental observation of consciousness. Everything that is conscious is conscious of information. And what I mean by that is all types of layers of consciousness function on taking a measurement of their surroundings, defining what that measurement means in relationship to self, storing that information, and then processing the information as in terms of stimulation or inhibition. Whether it's a chemical substance that is being detected and measured, or a stimulation such as an electrical stimulation, every form of consciousness at a fundamental level is a measurement. And this is how we can understand what we're dealing with when it comes to the question of quantum consciousness. There's a debate going on in science today on the question of consciousness' role in creating reality. And I think it's a misunderstanding. Pretty much the way it's written in quantum mechanics is that the observer causes the wave function collapse. In other words, the observer, by measuring a quantum particle that is in a superposition, meaning is in various probable positions, but when you try to measure it, it basically becomes coherent and becomes a localized space-time particle that has a definite location. And you would say, well, doesn't that sound like the observer has to be a conscious being? Well, no, because even in the various different experiments, the detector that detects where the particle is just an electronic device. So often you'll see a meme like this one, where it shows a person is not looking and the particle is spread out across space and time, and when the person looks, it snaps into a particular position. It's really kind of confusing, and it's unfortunate because that's not what's happening here. Consciousness does not cause the particle to be in a particular position. Anything that can absorb or detect the particle, including electronic devices, can also cause the wave function to collapse. What is very interesting, though. Now, I want to show you an experiment which basically contradicts everything I just said about consciousness not playing a role in the wave function collapse. Because this experiment basically should be interpreted that information does result in, how would I say, reality taking on a different property. So anyway, let's watch this and we'll discuss it. This is from Inspiring Philosophy. I like the way he clearly shows this, and let's just watch how he does it.
With the laser firing two entangled photons, either through slit A or slit B. Now it is truly random which slit it will fire through. Because we have no measuring device at either slit, we cannot know which slit the laser fires through until they pass through it and are detected on the other side. So at each firing, it will either go through A or B. Now the first prism splits the entangled photons and sends them in different directions. The top one goes to detector 0. Now if the photons only hit D0, we don't know the path information, since when the photon arrives, it could have either come from path A or path B. So because we don't know the path information, it should produce an interference pattern if it only came here. If we could place a measuring device at the slit, we would know the path information. But with just a result from D0, we don't know the path information.
So let me just hold it right there for a second and explain a little bit about what we're talking about. In quantum mechanics, there's an experiment using two slits by which if you shoot quantum particles at these two slits, if you are measuring which slit, or you put a measuring device on a slit so you can figure out which slit the quantum particle went through, then the quantum particle does something kind of bizarre. It acts just like you would expect. It acts like it's a particle. If you don't put a measuring device on the slits so that you do not know which slit the particle went through, then the particle acts like a wave. And this is the particle wave form duality in quantum mechanics. But it's interesting that the information being available to an observer is what changes the nature of a quantum particle. So just hold on to that. And this is exactly what's being discussed in this experiment, is that as these particles are going through different slits, there's different ways to determine information about them, and that information changes the behavior of those particles.
So because of the lack of knowledge we would have about the system, the particle would act in a way as if it goes through both, becoming the wave of possibilities it could have been, instead of one of these possibilities, if we knew the definite path information. But the other entangled photon goes the other way, and because it is entangled, it will affect the result of its twin that went to D0. Now the other photon from either A or B goes through the prism and hits either BSA or BSB. At both of these, there is a 50-50 chance it will either pass through or bounce off and go to either D4 or D3. Now if the photon hits either one of these detectors, notice what happens. We obtain which path information, because the only way the photon could hit D3 is if it came out of B, and the only way it could hit D4 is if it came out of A. There is no way a photon that came out of B could hit D4, and vice versa. So if a photon hits D3 or D4, we will know the path information it took, and we will get a clone pattern. Now if the photon randomly passes through BSA or BSB, it will either bounce off here or here, and it has a 50-50 chance of passing through BSC or bouncing off of it. So if the photon passes through BSA or BSB, we lose the path information, because if it hits D1 or D2, it could either have come from A or B. We can't ever trace the path information back to A or B. So when they hit D1 or D2, we should get an interference pattern, demonstrating the photon went through both slits, since we don't have definite path information.
So the prism itself is used to determine which slit the particle went through. So as you're looking at this experiment, you see under PS, which is the prism, the measuring device in essence. It provides information that we know which way the particle went. But you could also remove this information because there could be the question is, well, does the prism itself cause the collapse? Because notice that in detector D0, there is no collapse until you hit the detector. So let's keep that in mind. There is a collapse. They talk about the interference pattern on D0. So there's a collapse because you have a pattern. That pattern is from the particles collapsing. Now, the way it collapsed, it was into an interference pattern, but at some point, the detectors actually caused the wave to coalesce into a particle that got detected. Yes, before it hit the detector, it was still in a wave form. It was still a mix of possibilities. So that's what's important here, is to understand that consciousness, the knowledge of which way, doesn't mean it's the ultimate decider of the particle collapsing into a definite position, because we have that definite position at detector D0. It's just that it shows that before it hit the detector, it was acting as a wave. Whereas if the particles go through PS, or the prism, it behaves differently. It, at that point, acts like as if the prism itself caused the collapse, as if it ran into something. Well, it does. It runs into the crystal prism. And its interaction with the crystal prism, the question becomes, is that interaction creating the collapse of the wave function? So, and that means at D4 and D3, we get particle-like behavior, meaning, it's not spread out and interfering with each other just like a wave would interfere going through two slits. Instead, it bunches up and creates clumps. So let's continue.
Now here's one of the important implications of this experiment about what is causing collapse. Some argue physical interaction from the detector is what is causing the collapse. But if that was the case, D1 and D2 should cause collapse every time. But that is not what happens. If a photon makes it to D1 or D2, they always display an interference pattern. Yet every time a photon hits D3 or D4, a clump pattern is formed. But the only difference is what we, the observers, know about these two stations. Because of the experiment setup, we know that if a photon hits D3, it will always be a clump pattern, showing the photon only went through one slit. If it hits D1, we know it will always be an interference pattern, showing that the photon acted in a way as if it went through both slits. But the only difference between these two is what we, the conscious observer, knows about the system. Our knowledge of the system causes different results in how the photon will act. If it was all random and not caused by our knowledge, we should get some clump patterns at D1 and some interference patterns at D3. But that is not what the experiment shows. We always get a clump pattern at D3 and D4 because whenever a photon hits here, we always know the path information. And we always will get an interference pattern at D1 and D2 because we can never know the actual path information. So the photon acts in a way as if it goes through both. Whereas at D3 and D4, the photon only goes through one slit because we know the path information. The particles act in a way that correlates to our knowledge. See, what causes collapse is knowledge, and knowledge requires a knower. Sir Rudolph Peirce said, "The moment at which you can throw away one possibility and keep only the other is when you finally become conscious of the fact that the experiment has given one result." You see, the quantum mechanical descriptions is in terms of knowledge, and knowledge requires somebody who knows.
Okay. So that's the mysticism. That's the mystery. I'm not going to try to argue one way or another, but that is the mystery. How is it that the particle acts as if it's aware of our knowledge of it? Now I'm going to come right full circle on this and say that there's a lot of arguments against this particular experiment. And the primary argument is, which I actually find difficult to accept. The argument used to debunk this is that the beam splitter. So the beam splitter in this particular case, after the light goes through the prism, it hits a beam splitter, and only half of the information, or half of the time, does the particle go through the beam splitter. So what some people will argue is that the beam splitter is removing particles from the experiment, resulting in what looks like an interference pattern simply from the interactions of the beam splitter itself. Because the beam splitter basically has pulled out some of the photons. When you pull out some of the photons, it simply looks like some of the photons have been removed, and that creates a fringe, or what looks like an interference pattern, but it's not caused by the photon actually acting as a wave. They will argue that the prism itself did cause the collapse, and that the beam splitters actually cause the interference patterns down at the bottom. So they will argue that there is a physical interaction that is occurring that is due to the apparatus. What is my take on this? Well, the beam splitter in this experiment is actually being used for what creates the interference pattern and what also creates the clumps. So in both cases, it's the same apparatus, same beam splitter. So 50% of the time, the photon goes through, the other time it doesn't go through. You should basically have the same pattern each and every time. I guess the question then, and would be an interesting experiment, is at mirror MA and mirror MB, if you were to put a detector there, we should not get an interference pattern because we haven't lost the information. And if that is true, then beam splitter A and beam splitter B is not causing the interference pattern. That is what is used to debunk this experiment. So, but this is where we're at in science today, is we're still debating this question on whether or not there's an interaction between consciousness and the waveform collapse. Yet, let's think about that though. Again, the detectors caused the collapse. We know that the cameras or whatever you use to detect the particles at the time of complete absorption of them, that device causes the particle to truly be a particle. So we know it's not consciousness that is doing it, at least not the observer's consciousness. The question really should be, is the quantum particle conscious of being observed? Is there anything at the level of just what a quantum particle is, which is a vibration in a field, but is there anything besides that vibration that is aware of the disturbance in the field and the interactions with that disturbance in a field? So remember, everything is a field, really, and all particles is a disturbance of that field. And when we measure the disturbance of the field, it's only because we ourselves are also disturbing the field. But if the field itself reacts to our measurement of the field, then what is that called? I already started off this video by describing consciousness. Consciousness is the ability to measure information, store that measurement, and process the information that is stored. That is what consciousness is. And you can scale it up. You can add all kinds of different measuring devices. You can think about what we have all over our body is measuring devices, sensors for all kinds of chemicals. Our noses sense chemicals, our tongue sense chemicals. Our skin sense pressure and heat and various different electromagnetic forces. Our eyes are attuned to electromagnetic waves of a certain type that our skin is not attuned to. But our skin still feels heat, so our skin can sense heat from a certain direction. It's similar to our eyes that can sense electromagnetic vibrations from a certain direction. When it all comes down to it, there are only so many forces in nature that can be measured. And our consciousness, at least for human beings, is designed to measure a certain kind of force in nature. And that force in nature is very clear. So, as I was saying, the basic fundamentals of consciousness is measurement. That's what our conscious self does. Whether you think it is an emergent property from our brains and its chemistry or not, consciousness starts off with a concept of measurement. That measurement turns into information. That information gets stored. then it gets processed in relationship to morphological information. So there's layers of consciousness. There is first the self-awareness. I know what I am made out of, in the sense of what shape I'm supposed to be in. I know where my fingers are supposed to be, my toes are supposed to be, the parts of my body. There is an innate consciousness of what shape I'm supposed to take. A spiritual awareness of how I'm supposed to look. Not at a detailed level, but the idea is simple. There is a human morphology. Ants, butterflies, you name it. Their cells are in a community where there's a consciousness of what their role is in that community and what that community's overall goals are. So there is a morphological consciousness of self. That's the beginning of consciousness, is the idea that you know what you need to survive. You have hunger to live, and living means something. It means maintaining equilibrium. It means maintaining metabolism. It means maintaining chemical form. You, as a living being, have such a sense of balance. This is a fundamental of morphology and a fundamental of consciousness in terms of how it can be scaled up with the forces of nature. Because not only do you have morphology, you also have the forces of nature that are acting against your morphology. So what are those forces of nature that act against maintaining equilibrium and maintaining your self-conscious morphology? So one is gravity. Gravity is something that acts in a way that may cause a deformation to morphology. And living organisms work against the force of nature of gravity as it applies to their morphology. So yeah, gravity is a force in nature that consciousness recognizes and takes a measurement of, and from that measurement stores the information and then processes it. Right. Strong force. Now, the strong force is not a force that consciousness is aware of. Neither is the weak force. These forces are in the nucleus of an atom, and they're not exposed to anything further than the radius of an atom normally. So it's not as if you can interact with these forces of nature. Whereas electromagnetism is a lot like gravity in that it has, you know, reach well beyond the radius of the nucleus. And in fact, it spans the entire universe in terms of its true reach, just like gravity. Technically, I mean, it gets to a point where the force is so minimal it means nothing. But again, these forces of nature act on fields. Those fields, electromagnetism, gravity, they cause disturbances in fields. And when we're talking about quantum consciousness, what is the meaning of that? It gets back to the experiment on the double slit and the quantum eraser experiment. Really, how does the quantum particle know it's being observed? Is consciousness truly limited to humans? I think not. We describe consciousness. Consciousness is clearly, based on the description I gave you, is not limited to humans. Single cellular animals have consciousness. It's not scaled out like ours, but it's there. They have the ability to measure, and they have the ability to store information about that measurement, and then they have the ability to act upon that information that has been stored. That is the full cycle of consciousness. Where I'm asking you to go is to the question of the fabric of the universe itself. Is there something conscious, based on the description I gave you, at the level of the fields that crisscross the entire cosmos? Something that can do what we see happening in the quantum level. And that is something that can know that we're observing it and disturbing it and respond to us, as well as anything else. Electronics can disturb the same fields. It can be sensed by whatever has the ability to do conscious processing at the level of fields in the universe. Is there something that can measure disturbances of the fields, store that information about the disturbance, and respond to it by causing a collapse, by making the field's locality information deterministic rather than a waveform probability. Picking a slit. Is there something in the universe that consciously picks a slit because it measures an observance? That's really the question, isn't it? That's quantum consciousness. It's not that we cause reality with our conscious powers of observational influence. The question is there something beyond our awareness in the universe at a level of fields that's conscious of the very foundations of the fabric of the cosmos? Thank you for joining me on this journey. I'm going to continue this one. We'll be back. We will be back as we explore those fields of nature and ask the question, can the universe itself be conscious?